Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another edition of Film Fanatic. So, it is Tuesday at about 11:41. Hope everyone's doing good. It is another spring day technically, but still kind of feels wintry. Kind of chilly. It got pretty cold last night. It got down to the 30s, but it's great that we're in sort of in spring mode. Technically, it is spring, so hope everyone's doing good. Again, I love to always give a shout out to people who come on board this wacky thing that I do. That's called Film Fanatic. The uh, the new subscribers, that's I love getting in contact with new people that I don't know. I just know through the World Wide Web, and the other thing that's been really awesome is more and more people have been well, obviously subscribing to the channel, but a lot more folks have been commenting on the videos, and that to me is super fun. I love corresponding with people from around the country or whatnot that have a deep love for films, because at the end of the day, it's not about me. It's about talking about kind of a shared passion around films, and how you know there's thousands if not millions of other people that have that same passion that I do. And at the end of the day, it's about the films, and so it's great. And I love interacting with other folks. It's pretty funny too. This morning, or actually last night, when I got home, and I had just responded to a few comments on my channel. I got home pretty late last night, and I happened to see that a couple of folks had commented, some newer subscribers, which is awesome. And it was funny. I did a review on this really awesome foreign film, this really great. I believe it is a German exploitation movie that came out in the 80s, and it's called The Hunting Ground. And I did a review on that show just probably about a few weeks ago. And it's on my favorite movie label, Mondo Macabra. Hands down, my favorite label as far. Mondo Macabra, I've talked a lot about it before. I'm going to probably do a future show where I'm just going to talk about that label, and maybe try to get some other thing. Maybe actually even reach out to the company itself, and maybe if I can get maybe somebody from the company to be a guest on the show. But they're my favorite label, and what they do is they specialize in putting out all of these super obscure exploitation movies from the 70s, 80s, and I've even come across movies from the 60s, even the 50s. But they really specialize in lots of obscure movies, and all things in the exploitation world. They run the gamut too. The horror exploitation, slasher exploitation movies, sex exploitation movies, just all these incredibly bizarre movies, but they're super obscure. And about 99% of the films that I've bought through this label I've never seen, and I've just been blown away by how awesome they are. And every time I see a title, I'm at a point. It's over the years since I've been really diving into the whole world of exploitation. And again, it's something I've always loved, but now I'm just, diving. I've just I've taken that plunge into really exploring that world. So now when I go to buy movies, it's made things a little bit easier. because I've gotten more familiar with the labels that now exist. You know, you have Vinegar Syndrome, you have Blue Underground, Severin, Mondo Macabra, and there's quite a few others. Those are the best ones. Severin is really a really awesome label. They they probably put the most love and care in their packages. As far, they tend to be a little bit more on the expensive side, but as you know, if you're a fan of these bizarre movies, you really get, and if you're a collector, you really get a bang for your buck, because they pack them with special features. The all the transfers from the original film to Blu-ray and 4K is spectacular. The artwork, the whole thing. But Mondo Macabra, I feel, takes even a deeper dive. If you like these weird exploitation movies, they specialize in really obscure movies. And they also, you know, for what it's worth, they really deliver the goods as far as the content, the quality. Every movie I've bought through Mondo Macabra always comes with a great special features edition. So since I've gotten really into diving into this whole world now when I go to Bull Moose, and to, you know, where I look up, you know, and try to find, I basically, it's a funny thing because now I have these different habits depending on where I go. I usually go to Bull Moose. That's the main place I go to buy movies. But then I also go to, as far as new movies go, that's usually where I'll drop the cash. And then the other places that I tend to go for movies are Goodwills. Particularly, I live here in Northport, Maine, and so I especially I usually go to the Goodwill in Rockland, Maine. That one is a really great Goodwill. I think it's the best one around as far as movies go. It's locally, it's probably the biggest Goodwill. There's one in Belfast, which is about 5 minutes, 7 minutes from my house, which is pretty good too. They don't have the selection that Rockland has as far as movies go. But usually, how I break it up is, and I've talked about it before, but when I go to Goodwill, I've bought tons of movies there, and I still buy movies there. And I don't really buy. Occasionally, I buy DVDs, but it's pretty rare. But usually, for the most part, when I buy movies, I try to always buy Blu-ray editions, and particularly like good editions. So when I go to Goodwill, I typically buy, I've bought a ton of like the Marvel movies, more, I guess, highbrow, if you want to call it. That sounds a little bit silly, but more, typically, more Hollywood-based films, commercial films that I actually really love. I've bought tons. I've really built up my Marvel collection. I've bought a ton of Marvel movies there, and quite a few other titles. But so typically when I go there, I'll buy like the more commercial oriented kind of films on Blu-ray, and I've really lucked out. But when I go to Blue Moose, I try to only buy exploitation movies. So I have like a different. I wear a different hat, huh, depending on where I'm going. So I usually, when I go to Bull Moose, I try to seek out, the weirdo exploitation movies, because they have an amazing selection. I really love the one in Waterville, and I really love the one in Brunswick. And I have found that those two shops have an awesome selection. But now that, since I've gotten more and more into that world, and I've gotten really familiar with the labels that put out these great movies, it makes it a lot easier for me to pick out movies. I don't really Sometimes I do, but I don't really go into a shop with a plan or a list of certain things that I'm looking for. I tend to enjoy the experience when I go into it cold and I discover something or I come across something I had seen before or whatnot. I used to have kind of a list of certain movies or even albums that I was looking for. So now, but now I just go in. Sometimes I'll have a title in my mind of something that I'm going to seek out. But generally, I enjoy the experience more when I just go in cold and I find something. So that's usually how I do it. And occasionally I'll come across another shop or some other place. Like a friend of mine had posted this clip or had posted this post about this. It's kind of like an Army Navy shop, but it's like a mom and pop place. But they sell. It's up by Augusta, and they sell. I can't remember the name of it, but it's like a real kind of a rickety shop. But they sell lots of odds and ends as far as clothing. But they have a massive movie collection. They don't really have many Blu-rays, but they have a massive DVD selection. And I went up there on a whim because it looked kind of interesting, and I found some movies up there that I bought on DVD last year that I had never seen before. One in particular that I was really excited about was a Ridley Scott movie called The Duelist, and that's a really awesome movie. And I bought that on DVD there. But that's generally how I go about buying movies. But so this one guy who had this new subscriber who had commented on this movie called The Hunting Ground, which is a Mondo Macabro title, and I believe it's a German film, and it's from the early '80s, and it's a killer movie. I had never seen it before. It's a really awesome exploitation movie, and it's probably one of the most disturbing movies that I've seen in recent time, especially the last half, the last act of the movie. But just all around, just an incredible movie. Really great story, really original. But the last act of that film is it's completely shocking. And I was like, wow. I found myself being like, holy shit, you know. And I've seen it a few times, and it's called The Hunting Ground, but it's a foreign movie, and I believe it's a German movie. And this one guy was commenting on how it was funny. It was a funny comment, and I know everybody's got their own opinions, but he was saying how he went on he commented on the post, and he was talking about how much he loves foreign films, and he kind of indicated in this post that he loves foreign films more than 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 anything else. But at the same time, he said that he hates reading subtitles. And my first reaction was like, that doesn't make very much sense to me. So it was weird, and and it was funny because I try not to be obnoxious when I respond to people, or I try not to be a dick or whatever. And I realize, we all make mistakes as far as we might not proofread something that we write, or we might do things too fast, and we look at the post afterwards, and you're like, oh wait, maybe the spelling is terrible, so I gotta edit it. But anyway, so he in this post, I noticed his grammar was kind of terrible. So, but I responded in saying, I said thanks a lot for commenting and subscribing to the channel, and my response to him was, well, in my experience, like, I love foreign films, and most of these exploitation movies that I've been covering are technically all foreign films. And one of the coolest things about these movies that I've been buying is that they typically come with two versions of the film. There's the American dubbed version, and then also the foreign version where it's in its native language. And in my experiences, the experiences that I've had around watching foreign films for a long time is that if you have the option to watch a film whether it's in its dubbed American version or it's in its native language or its native version, I always usually go for the foreign, the original cut, the original foreign version with the subtitles. And the reason I do that is I have found that about 99% of the time, the story and the translation is very different than from where when you watch the American version. You you kind of get this skewed version of the film, and I have even seen it in almost, well, in extreme terms of where the narrative for the story can be very different because things just initially get lost in translation. Sure, for like, you know, particularly around the exploitation movies, there's a fun in watching the dubbed versions of and watching the American dubbed versions of the films because it adds a certain quality to it where it's really extra. It gives it an extra campy quality, and it's kind of entertaining that way, and it's more hilarious. And there are films out there that you can't, they might be so obscure that you can't get the original cut. But I found in my travels and also with most of the movies that I buy when it comes to foreign films, particularly in the exploitation world, there is that option to watch it, and I have in its native tongue, and I have found that, like, that there'll be situations of where almost 20 or 30% of the story gets lost when you watch the American version. The narrative can be really off. Scenes can be cut. The dialogue, everything will be totally off. And when I have and compared versions of a film, when I typically watch the the original foreign version, I find that the story is way more cohesive and it's way easy to follow. There's not these giant plot lines. The translation is there. So that's the way I go. And I don't understand. People have hang-ups and people have their opinions, but I just never could understand the idea that, or understand why people don't like reading subtitles or have hang-ups around it, because we all hopefully read or can read, and we all enjoy to sit, and sit down, hopefully to read a book occasionally, or maybe we're an avid reader. I really enjoy reading, so I don't understand what the difference is. But anyway, I basically responded saying, well, that's fine, but I feel like as a fan, you kind of do yourself a disservice by having that opinion. Because I feel like if you have that option to watch the film in its native tongue, you're going to get a lot more out of it. I think you do a disservice to yourself as a viewer, but then also to the filmmakers, because about 90% of the time, those American versions are cut and edited and censored and kind of watered down, and the translation is off. So that's just my thing. But anyway, keep the opinions and the comments coming. I love it. It's pretty much my favorite part of doing this show. So that brings me to today's movie. I am. This is a movie I discovered quite a few years ago through a recommendation to my really great buddy Sean Russell, who was a guest on the show last year. Another, fellow film fanatic, and that is The Kill List. This movie is one of my all-time favorite horror movies. This was directed by Ben Wheatley, who is a pretty famous British horror director. His name has really rised to prominence in kind of the indie horror world, and he's put out a bunch of different movies, and I'll get into some of his other films. But I remember this film came out quite a few years ago. This is only a DVD copy, but this copy is really great. It comes with. I would love to get this on Blu-ray at some point or 4K, but I'm really happy with this edition. The transfer is really amazing. It came out in 2011, and it's a movie I never hear discussed. I think it's one of the most underrated horror films that's come out in the last, 20, 30 years. But I think as far as like contemporary horror films, and again, this is from 2011, so it's quite a few years. It's pretty old uh, by today's standards, but this movie I think is kind of a masterpiece. And my friend Sean Russell, I remember he back then, back around 2010 or 2011, he was he had recommended this movie to me. He's like, there's this new, he loves all kinds of films, but he's really into horror films like I am. That's pretty much his jam too. And he had recommended this movie to me. And the way I got this film was pretty funny, but it was back before Redbox and, before a lot of the streaming services, because 2011 was a long time ago now. And it was before, all of the streaming platforms. And it was back when Hannaford, the local big supermarket franchise here in Maine, you could go into, you could get your groceries, but they also had a really large video rental place, and you could go in and rent movies, rent DVDs. And he had told me about this, and he said, "Yeah, you got if you get a chance, see this movie, The Kill List." It had just kind of come out, and he said it's a brutal, it's such a brutal movie. It's one of the best horror movies that he had seen at that time, and he's like, "You got to see this." And I rented it at Hannaford of all places, and I was just like, my jaw dropped. I was just like, this movie is the shit. Like, it's so awesome. And then within a year's time, it was like announced that, Hannaford was basically going to be cutting out their video rentals. And so they stopped renting movies, but they had this big sale. And there wasn't all this, there wasn't a lot of notice around it. And I remember going in there when they were selling all their movies, and they had the Kill List for sale, and it was $5 on DVD, and it was the copy that I rented, and so I bought it right away. And I've seen this movie a gazillion times. I love this movie to death. I do want to get this on Blu-ray and 4K, but this edition's really great. It's got a lot of great special features on here, and again, I think this is one of the most underrated horror films ever. If you're a fan of horror, especially really gritty, it's such a raw and it's such a dark movie, but it's so awesome. The atmosphere is just incredible. One of the real cool things about this film is it was released by Hammer Studios in England. It's an English movie. Ben Wheatley is an English director, and I have a huge love, and it's something I'm going to do some future shows on because I have to do it. But I have a huge love for Hammer Studios, and folks out there who probably most folks know what Hammer is, or the Hammer Studios, but there's probably a lot that don't. But Hammer Studios for me is something that all of their movies I grew up on, and Hammer Studios was basically an English studio that started putting movies out in the late 50s, 60s, right through the 70s and into the 80s. And I think they kind of, as a company, I don't know what happened, but they basically stopped putting out any films for almost 2 decades. And when I saw that this was like a Hammer release, I was like, wow, like that's really interesting. And since then, I have seen that they have kind of come back as a studio, and they have put out a handful of other films since then. But Hammer Studios, for me, like I said, I have a deep connection to Hammer Studios, a deep love. Hammer Studios was one of the studios that introduced me to horror as a kid, and they're most well known for all of the various Dracula movies that they put out, starring the iconic Christopher Lee. They put out about 15 to 20 versions of Dracula films starring Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. They also did a whole series of all of the other Universal monsters, including obviously Dracula probably being the best. They did versions of Frankenstein, the monster, the Mummy, the Wolfman, a whole bunch of different editions, or a whole bunch of movies. And Hammer Studios is probably most well known for their work with Christopher Lee, who is one of the icons of horror. And as a kid, seeing those films that were originally being put out in the 60s and 70s, and seeing Christopher Lee play Dracula in all his gothic glory was just a magical experience. And those films always, and even to this day, I love those movies to death. And one of the kind of the cool things about Hammer Studios was they had, as a company, they had this really over the top kind of theatrical aesthetic to a lot of their films. They used these really large like set pieces for like the castles, and they also shot in all these different locations around England and in London. But they had this real theatrical flair, and they built all of these sets, and they had a lot of the people that were involved with Hammer Studios had backgrounds in theater, so a lot of those kinds of skills were kind of put forth in the film. So a lot of the films have they almost to a degree almost play out like a play, but they're very theatrical. They're very over the top. They're super campy. They're kind of silly. There's always a pretty good amount of gore, or copious amounts of gore, and they just have this beautiful aesthetic around them. I've always thought the atmosphere for Hammer films is just so awesome. And seeing Christopher Lee, as Dracula was always just mesmerizing. And they always had sexy women in all of the movies. The sets were always beautiful, and the movies were always a little bit cheesy and kind of ridiculous, but they were so amazing. And they had this quality of where, on one hand, the production value was really high, but then the budgets for a lot of the films was really, really low. And you could see, both of those sides of the spectrum in their films. But overall, they were just so magical. And that was, when I was a kid, seeing those films, that was how I discovered Dracula. And how I discovered Christopher Lee. I mean, just one of the most iconic actors in horror ever, along with Peter Cushing. Just amazing. So when I saw Kill List and I realized, wow, this is a Hammer Studios release, I was like, holy mackerel. I thought they had basically stopped putting out films, but this is a full-on Hammer Studio production. So, and at the time, this movie was very, very modern, and it still is. It still really holds up in that light. So it's got a very different look to it, but an amazing film. This film too also really reminds me of the original Wicker Man, which I did a show on way back when, which also was a Hammer Studio film. That was one of the best roles that Christopher Lee has ever done. Probably the best role. He was also in that who played Dracula. And this film really has, I think, a deep influence with The Wicker Man. But again, it's very, very different. It's its own thing. And it's super gritty, it's brutal as all hell, highly disturbing, but it has a really cool like occult aesthetic. And it's kind of centered around this kind of mysterious like cult society. And it's just amazing. It's such an amazing movie. It's brutal as all hell. It's basically centered on these two guys that are hitmen, and they're hired by this, by this very wealthy guy who is like part of this like real shadowy crime organization that is really underground, and they basically give these employ these two hitmen to with a kill list, and they have to kill a series of these different people. And as they're going through this journey, they get pulled into this. They get pulled further and further into this really dark, mysterious universe, and it's just a stunning movie. The last act of this film is bone chilling. Visually, it's such an amazing movie. And I never hear this movie ever talked about, which I'm always just like blown away by, because I know, like I said in the beginning of the show, Ben Wheatley has become a pretty well known director, and I've seen most of his films. I like his films. There's a lot of his. He's he's a real interesting director because his other films, like, he's kind of crossed different genres. He's gone into, to a degree, like science fiction oriented kinds of films, crime films, horror films, dramas, and he has a kind of a unique style where he'll blend different genres together. I I would say out of the movies that he's done, this is like straight up horror. Like, this is full throttle, coming at you, going for the jugular. This is like 100% a horror film, but it's incredibly suspenseful and atmospheric. But his other films, they're harder to define, and I like his films. I don't. I would say that, at least in my opinion, that Kill List is easily the best film of his. I have found that with some of his other films, they're not quite as cohesive as this is, as far as story goes. Sometimes I get a sense that maybe he is overstretching himself by trying to be so innovative and so unique. I think as a director, he's pretty visionary. He's a visionary, and he's really he's a real visionary director, and he's innovative in lots of ways. But I sometimes think with his other films, there's like a lack of cohesiveness, and whereas the Kill List is so strong, and the script is so strong, and the characters are just so rich in the story. And I feel, at least with some of his other films, it's a little bit harder to follow the narrative, and maybe that's intentional. But again, I do want to see his other films again. I've seen them all pretty much once or twice, pretty much for one time. And I did like them, and I thought they were really cool and interesting and super bizarre. Some of his films are incredibly bizarre, and they have a real surrealistic quality, which is great. But, I think it suffers a little bit from what I mentioned, but that's just my opinion. He's made a bunch of movies since then, But High Rise is a movie that came out in 2015. A very strange. It's a very strange film, and it's really hard to. Well, I think to its credit, it's hard to define what kind of a movie it is. It has many different elements, but it is cool. It's a very strange film, and it is something I probably will. It would be great to see again. But like I said, Kill List is my favorite. I just think that it's a masterpiece. That came out in 2011. He did a movie called Rebecca in 2020 with Armie Hammer, who is an actor who just recently, basically his whole career was canceled. Armie Hammer was in The Social Network, but that's kind of a cool movie too. It's kind of interesting, but again, not sure what I really think of it. Free Fire in 2016, which I haven't seen. In the Earth in 2021, which I haven't seen. Sightseers, which is actually a pretty cool movie. It's like a black comedy, but again, it's got so many different genres thrown in the mix. But it's a pretty cool movie. It's super bizarre, but it's definitely a more of a comedy. That's a pretty cool movie. A friend in Another movie that is a really bizarre movie that is actually a pretty interesting movie, and again, it's something I'd like to see again. A Field in England, very surrealistic movie. Down Terrace is a pretty cool movie too. That's an action movie he did. That's more of like a crime drama. That's actually a really cool movie. Happy New Year in 2018. The ABCs of Death he also did, which is okay. I thought that movie was okay. Freak Shift is another film that he's done. The Ghoul in 2016. Some of these movies I haven't seen. He's been really prolific. In Fabric in 2018. The Greasy in 2016. Um, so I mean, he's like again, he's really built a career since the Kill List has come out. But I I can't recommend this movie enough. I think it is a horror masterpiece. Even though this came out in 2011, I think it's one of the best like modern horror films that's come out in the last 20, 30 years. Just so incredible. And to be honest, I wish people talked about this film more because this movie is, if you're a fan of really gritty horror that is just that has balls and goes to places that you don't expect, this is the movie for you. This is truly an intense experience, and it's completely riveting from the beginning to the end. Just amazing, amazing. So yeah, I can't recommend this movie enough. I'm looking forward to eventually buying this on Blu-ray. But The Kill List, 2011, by Ben Wheatley, amazing movie. Please go see it if you're a fan of really good horror, really great quality horror films. Definitely seek this out. So thanks again. If you like this channel, please like and subscribe, and we will see you next time. Peace.